So one of the most common questions that I get asked is how did I get started in OT cybersecurity? And another common question I get is, well, how did I get started posting on LinkedIn or YouTube? And not just how, but why? And for me, the answers to all of those are very intertwined. So the purpose of this video is to share my story, and ideally it'll help people out there that want to get into OT and ICS cybersecurity or post on social media like LinkedIn and YouTube. Because the whole point of this video is if I can do this, anybody can do this, which includes you. So when I think of how I got even started in just IT, because I come from the IT world, the IT cybersecurity world. I actually grew up with a kid, my friend Chris. And Chris was the kind of stereotypical hacker kid you think of, like the kid that had his computer in his room and would stay up late night. And of course, back then, we didn't have the internet. We had the old bulletin board systems that you would dial in with the old phone lines and hear the modem scratching and that horrible sound. And I would watch him do things like crack video games so you could copy them illegally. He would write cheat codes for games so you had unlimited gold and unlimited lives. And I just was always fascinated. Now, I'm always the good kid, right? I'm the good boy. So I would never do any of those things, but I definitely would watch. And just always stuck with me that if you had somebody like Chris, who nicest guy you'd ever meet, would do things like this, then what could somebody do if they had, you know, ill intent, if they're malicious? And that, again, that's just always stuck with me. So my first job actually in IT was actually, I think, as a junior in high school. And it was actually a QA tester for a company that wrote software that was kind of like the predecessor to Microsoft Office. I was really excited because they had actual PCs, and I had never touched a PC. We had always worked with Apples. And my grandparents had bought me an Apple IIc. I'm sure they saved up every penny they could to buy that. And but I got this job, and I actually beat out Chris for this job. I felt horrible in that respect. And I worked there for I think about 6 months, getting experience with PC, wrote a lot of documentation. I used to be really good at writing. So I wrote like half of their 500-page manual as a junior in high school, believe it or not, which I think is kind of funny. And then we actually got laid off. The other guy I worked with, he was also in from a different high school in town, and we actually got laid off because one night after hours we were playing Star Trek video game on one of the PCs, and the owner had come in with some investors. It's like 9 o'clock at night, and so they thought that didn't look really good on the company, which I didn't think there was anything wrong with it because it was after hours. So, but ended up leaving there, and then actually ended up working in a movie theater, which was the best job I've ever had. But after the movie theater and somewhere in there, I also started going to school. So I graduated high school, started going to college, and then I started working in a bowling alley. And I eventually would end up working in the back of the bowling alley. So I actually was, fixing bowling machines, bowling pin machines when they were breaking down. And a lot of that included electrical work. So I shocked myself quite a few times. I really just kind of was replacing parts and doing things without really nobody teaching me, not really even reading. I just kind of did what I thought would work, and it usually did. So I became a little bit mechanical, and it was really cool because you could work in the back of the bowling alley, and you really didn't have to deal with anybody. It was rare to actually see anybody unless someone was working the same shift as you. I could do homework. I could read. It was a great job in that respect. And eventually the bowling alley ended up closing, and I went to still going to school. and there was a company that had come in. The company was mostly made up of old oil field guys, like roughnecks from like Oklahoma and Texas. And what they did was they would come in and strip out bowling alleys, which at the time in the United States were going bankrupt, just like the one that I worked in. And they were stripping out those bowling alleys, and they would take them overseas and put them in other countries where bowling was becoming popular. And so they said, hey, we need help stripping out the bowling alley. You want to help out? Like, sure. I didn't have anything else to do as far as work. So I'm like, sure. And then after about a week, they came and said, hey, you really bust your butt. You know the electronics, you know the electrical. It's like, hey, you want to come work for us? And I was like, they're like, oh, well, we got jobs lined up in Beijing and Munich and I think they're Moscow wouldn't be on my list today. A couple other big cities around the world, and I thought about it, and I had just my dad had just died. I just lost my girlfriend, and so I just lost my job. That's right. So I dropped out of school at the point where I actually got all Fs because it was so late in the semester to go on this grand adventure, and I ended up going to China for my first job with them. And I'm there for a day, and the American guy I was with, this Oklahoma roughneck, gets in a fight with the Chinese boss. And the American, my boss, tells me, hey, I'm going home tomorrow, and you can come with me or you can stay here. And I was like, not much of choice in a way. Like, you're not leaving me really a choice. I don't have anything at home. So I'm just gonna stay. And so I ended up basically staying for almost 2 years and did a lot of, it was building bowling alleys, right? Putting them back together, doing, a lot of the electrical work, the computer work, and even, I mean, putting down wood lanes and building the machines. And that was pretty much what I did. And during that time also, there were a lot of people that came to me because if they had a computer problem anywhere in the town, they would know, oh, if you have a manual that's in English, you can go ask this guy and he'll help you out. And so I ended up doing a lot of kind of IT work that way. So when I came back from China, I ended up working for this company that did IT training and mostly around office products. So they would go into different companies and teach their employees how to use Microsoft Word or Excel or Access. And I would order the books and I would take them to the different places that we would teach on site. And we also had 7 classrooms at our own location. So I'd be responsible for rebuilding the systems every night for the classes the next day. Well, they also had Microsoft system administrator courses or the system engineer, the MCSE, if you're ever familiar with those classes. And so when I started there, it was the NT40 days, and they were just transitioning into Windows Active Directory with Windows 2000. And so I was asked by the gentleman there that was in charge of all the trainers if I wanted to become an instructor. And I really didn't want to teach Word and Excel, so I was like, "No, thank you." He's like, "Oh no, you don't understand. No, we want you to teach the administration stuff." And so I was like, "Okay, kind of what's involved." And so they laid it out. You have to go get these Microsoft certifications, and you would take a test, and when you pass that test, then we'll give you an increase in your salary. So I think I was making like $40,000 a year to start. And basically each time you took a test, it was an additional $10,000. And so it was pretty quick before I was making more money than I ever thought would have been possible. And so I think I was making $100,000 within like 6 to 9 months. Pretty quick teaching MCSE courses. And they also had networking fundamentals course. They started doing CCNA courses. So I also did the CCNA stuff. And then I actually started to teach security. So I actually wrote a cybersecurity course that essentially was kind of a intro to pen testing, IT pen testing. And I had a blast doing that. And it was really fun bringing, having students come in and take this class that I wrote that I had put together. And that just kind of went over time. That company actually closed their doors, but they got bought out by a company that also they wanted to do training, but also consulting. So that's how I ended up working with the Navy and the Marine Corps to help them design Active Directory for the an MCI, their big intranet is what they called it. And then through that, I ended up getting a job working with the U.S. Navy SEALs for basically 2 years and working mostly with the support teams and doing a lot of training and some consulting. And so I had a blast with that, learned a lot, just in how the military and the government operated, met a lot of great folks. And so eventually that kind of ran out and then I had got an opportunity to become essentially a network engineer at a company. And I actually got this opportunity because I had presented at a local community group. It was the local ISSA chapter on cybersecurity. And honestly, I don't even remember what I talked about. It's been that long ago. It'd be kind of interesting to see. But one of the guys through that group had offered me this role. And so I went to work there. It wasn't very long before I was promoted to manager. And so I ended up managing network services and security. I did that for more than a few years and built out, I think, we had an incredible team. And that kind of coincided with me moving to the East Coast. So I actually flew back and forth for 2 years while I had that job. And then that company had some issues with the United States government for apparently doing some shady sales practices in how they operated or worked with some of the colleges and universities. And so they went from like 4,000 employees to 50 employees pretty much overnight. And eventually, it was my time to go. And so I went from there. I went to work at a telecom. This was actually the first job and the only job I actually applied for online. Everywhere else, like I always knew somebody, right? Like the gentleman I had worked or I had, met at that ISSA meeting that I had spoken at. And so I went to work for this telecom. At the telecom, I had built out their program for their managed security customers. So basically, their customers, and they had about 200,000 business class customers, if I remember right at the time, where they could purchase a Fortinet firewall. And so my job was to help the developers create a online platform that the customers would go and where they can make their own firewall rule changes, or they could do things like turn on and off URL filtering, and they could, specify which sites to block and not, right? So they could control the firewall without having access to the firewall. They would have this web interface that we had designed. So I did that, and I also built out the SOC, and then they got bought out by a large company. So they added like 17 million residential customers. So it was really cool that they continued to use the SOC and they continued to use a lot of those services that I had helped build. But I didn't like the being bought and sold aspect of the telecom business. So I started looking for other opportunities and I actually got a job doing pen testing, which is really what I was having fun doing. And to do that full time, which was an incredible opportunity. And so I went to do that. I thought I did some great work there. My manager was definitely a different personality type than myself, I would say. And so after it's probably not even a year, I realized, and there were many reasons, but I realized that while I loved doing pen testing, I didn't want to do things like, sales that they also wanted me to help out with. That, just not who I am. And it just it just wasn't a good fit with their kind of their business model. So I had spent a weekend thinking about what to do. Actually decided I'm gonna, give this my 100% for the near future and we'll see what happens. And then the following Monday I got a call about an interview where I'm currently at Floor. And I had no idea what Floor did. And I had just known that, again, didn't get along with my boss. I didn't necessarily see that changing. So it was definitely time to move on. It sounded like a good opportunity, right? It was a large company. I knew that. Large offices in where I live here in Greenville, South Carolina. And so I was like, okay, we'll do this. And little beknownst to me, I'm at Floor now, and I've been there 14 and a half years, I think, just about at this point. But Floor is one of the largest engineering and construction companies in the world. And so I literally work with, and I can ping somebody or I can just call somebody who's one of the more brilliant engineering minds in the world, from control systems to nuclear engineering to chemical engineering to process engineering and safety. And the list goes on and on. I'm very, very lucky for where I work today. And it's interesting because so far we've talked about a lot of the places where I've worked, and I kind of wanted to share that path, right? And I always had not only this, I was always steering towards something in IT, but there was also, cybersecurity always in the back of my mind. And whether it was building that pen testing course out for the training company, I still remember putting in the first internet router at that company. And I remember starting to doing the installation. My boss was watching me over my shoulder, and I was adding the password. He's like, "Why are you adding a password? No one will be able to log into this from over the internet." I was like, "Sure, they could. Like, let's just add the password just in case." That time it was just always there in the back of my mind, and so that's kind of the path I took, at a high level through my different jobs. Now, I want to take a step back because we started, this whole conversation about how did I get into OT or ICS cybersecurity. So I went to work at Floor, I think about 2011. Now, in 2010, so just a year before, this is where the news of Stuxnet had come out. Remember, Stuxnet was a piece of malware that got into the Natanz facility in Iran. This facility is where they would do the enrichment of uranium gas to ultimately be used in building nuclear weapons. And so the United States and the Israelis had teamed up to create this incredible piece of malware. And this is really what had me hooked initially. There's a couple of things, right? Because they had this piece of malware, and sure, it used 4 Windows 0 days to move from Windows machine to Windows machine. I don't know. I wasn't terribly impressed with that. I'm like, but it did show that this came from a state adversary, right? No one's going to have, you know, multiple 0 days unless they're a state adversary. So you already knew it was a state adversary. But I think where it got really interesting was this malware would move from Windows machine to Windows machine to where then it would find these Siemens controllers that were responsible for controlling the centrifuges out in the real world. And so it would use physics to break down those centrifuges slowly over time. So think if you can spin up the centrifuge and spin it down and up and down and up and down and up and down. Basically, you like turn it on, turn off, turn it on, turn off. If you do that fast enough, like if you take a light switch and you just flip it on and off like a million times, eventually something's going to break. Same thing if you do it to a computer or a printer, or you get the idea. That system, that machine is going to break. So I was really fascinated with they could over the wire, right, break down these systems. And where it even got more interesting for me was that if you were sitting in the control room and you're watching all the dashboards and all the blinky lights, that if you were sitting there and the centrifuges, right, they're out there in the lab slowly breaking down over time because they're spinning up and spinning down and turning on, turning on, turning on, really fast, that everything looked perfectly normal. So not only did Stuxnet take control over the centrifuges and slowly break them down using physics, but they also made it look like everything was perfectly fine. So all of that put together, I just blew my mind. And there was an extra hook because I remember when I used to walk in the mornings and sometimes at lunch, where I was in San Diego at the time, and it was kind of in the Silicon Valley of San Diego. It was actually called Sorrento Valley. And so I actually would walk by the Siemens building. So it just, oh, I remember walking by the Siemens building thinking about Stuxnet. And that was where, again, I started to get hooked. And then I started to ask, like, well, how does this work in a power plant? Like, do we have computers in a power plant? Like, eh, I think we do. I mean, we must, but like, how does this work? And so that's where I started asking questions. But I wasn't working at floor quite yet. So I was asking these questions. And this was just at the time I was, going back and forth between the East Coast and the West Coast. But how does this work? And I had some friends that worked at the local power company and the local water company, and I would start trying to ask them, and they didn't really know. And I realize now it's just that they weren't doing anything about cybersecurity, right? Back then. And then fast forward with, oh, I get my job at Floor, and I'm just getting in the handle, kind of in the swing of things, building out my team, mostly focused on vulnerability management, offensive security, right? Penetration testing, and a few other things. And doing that for probably, good 6, 12 months. And then realizing, oh, we're an engineering company. It's like, oh, we might have some of these control systems or these things like PLCs laying around. And and that's where I started down this path and started, over time to meet different engineers and having those conversations about control system cybersecurity. And it was really evident that, they're just like everywhere else in the world at the time, there were very few people that even knew control system or OT or ICS cybersecurity was even a thing. Even even today, right? Not everybody's aware of it. Not everybody in engineering and not everybody in IT is aware of it. And not everybody in engineering or IT want anything to do with it. And I get that. Like, I don't want to be a developer, right? Just like other people, yeah, they don't want to do OT cybersecurity. I completely get that. But that's how I got into OT and ICS cybersecurity, believe it or not. And then just asking those questions. And I was very frustrated, initially trying to learn and even working with engineers, right? They just see you as somebody, coming from IT and that you don't take it seriously. And they don't take you seriously until you demonstrate that. So that, building up that trust, it took a little while. So it was really interesting. And there weren't a lot of resources, right? There weren't any classes. There weren't any YouTube videos. I think SANS was just starting their courses. And so it was a struggle. I remember being so frustrated in wanting to learn about ICS cybersecurity. And there was nothing I could do about it, no matter how hard I tried. But it was one of those things you just kept pushing and just kept pushing. And then little by little, it almost felt like 3 steps forward, but then it was like 5 steps back. But just kept chunking along bit by bit to where then I was learning from people at work. I went after about a year, I went to my first project site, which is one of the largest power plants. I say always traditional power plants. It was non-nuclear, but one of the largest power plants in the world. And just standing there in that facility, which was still being built, but 1/3 of it was operational. So they were generating electricity, and you could feel the electricity in the air around you. It was very scary and very exhilarating at the same time. And I remember, the plant manager giving me a tour and talking about, all the different Windows systems, and that they had Active Directory and they had a data historian running SQL Server, and I was like, what do you mean? It's the first time I realized, like, there's Windows everywhere in OT, and that's kind of where, yeah, again, I've been at Floor since then, and I've just continued that that path. But that's kind of my career path, right? And how I progressed through IT and IT cybersecurity and then into OT and ICS cybersecurity, where I am today, where I get to help, right, build in security into some of the largest OT ICS environments in the world. I'm very privileged to be able to do that. But I also realize there's a lot of people that were like me back in 2010 that want to learn about OT and ICS cybersecurity, and that they're frustrated because in some respects, up to like a year or two ago, there still weren't a ton of resources. Or yeah, there were a few classes, but they're super expensive. And so while, yeah, I've been fortunate to go to all the SANS courses. I've been very, very fortunate. I'm very thankful for that opportunity. They're very expensive, especially today, and not everybody can afford that. Like, I wouldn't be able to afford those on my own time. And so there's still just not a lot of resources. So that's a big part of why I also started then posting on LinkedIn and YouTube, because I wanted to make sure that if there were people out there like I was back in 2010, 2011, where I wanted nothing more than to learn OT or ICS cybersecurity. OT wasn't even a term back then, but I wanted to learn ICS cybersecurity, but I couldn't. I mean, there just weren't any resources, and I was so frustrated. So I figured, hey, if I could post something on LinkedIn, if I could create a YouTube video that would help at least one person not be as frustrated, it was worth it. And that's really how I got started. And so that's kind of where I'm at today. So, you know, not only, doing my day job and helping, work with engineers to secure some of the largest OT ICS environments, but also, helping others learn about OT ICS, right? How to get in the field, or for operators in the field, and engineers and PLC techs and others working in OT, how to learn about OT cybersecurity. And for those that run the environments, right, how to build out their cybersecurity programs. Because ultimately, we all have to come together to be able to protect OT. It's not an IT thing versus an OT thing. Remember, I've worked on both sides of the fence. Sure, I come from an IT background, an IT cyber background. I also work with 4,000 control system and electrical engineers in my day job, right? Again, there's very few companies that size, nor with the experience and the level of engineering minds that we have at Floor that I get to learn from. So if I can take all of that and be able to share it, at least from my perspective, in a way that I learn best by keeping it simple and practical and sharing stories. And that's what I always focus on in all of my content. Just keep it simple, straightforward, practical, because I want to be able to take that information in, and I want to be able to use it. I want to put it into practice, right? Because it's ultimately about protecting OT. It's about protecting ICS. It's about protecting the world around us, making sure our families and our friends and our communities have what they need and we're safe. So keep it simple, keep it practical, and yeah, make it available so people have what they need to learn about OT and ICS and keeping it secure. So I appreciate you for taking the time to listen to my story. Hopefully, it helps give you some ideas, a little bit more about your own path and things that you can do. Again, everybody's path is different. This is just happens to be mine, and it's not quite done yet. We'll see what what comes next, but hopefully, it helps you and maybe helps you kind of guide you in your own and making decisions for the future. So thanks again for the time. I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching. If you did like the video, please go ahead and like it and subscribe to the channel if you're not. And I'll see you in the next video.